Welcome back to WTF Is Up. We're really excited today to have an interview with my good friend, old roommate, amazing tennis player, entrepreneur, investor, do-gooder, Matt Haldeman. Matt, I wore my do-good shirt for you today for this
Love it.
episode, as our hundreds of thousands of subscribers online can see. So Matt, we'd like to kick off our episodes with a dad joke. I was trying to think of something Scrubs related because I know that we both love that show. And I've been wondering why the janitor, played by Neil Flynn, was not in the revival that I know we've been watching. And so, inspired by that character, here's my dad joke. Ready? What does the janitor say when he pops out of the closet?
What does he say?
Supplies.
Oh, I want to know what jokes lost to that joke. What jokes didn't make
yeah.
cut?
Here's the other one I was thinking about. Matt, I know you just got back from a big edtech conference in San Diego. I know you just flew back. So, boy, your arms must be tired.
Oh, there you go.
Man, classic.
All right.
It's an oldie but
Great.
a goodie.
Well, we have Matt Haldeman with us today. He's had a really long career in education, starting as a teacher in low-income schools in DC and Harlem, went to Harvard Business School, then on to consulting, corporate leadership in large and boutique education companies and investment groups. He's really now, I think, trying to change how people think about impact and maybe challenging some of our old views on nonprofit, for-profit, for benefit, for impact, consolidation in the mission-oriented sector. Does it all really matter? And he's going to help us make sense of all of this today. So, Matt, thanks for joining us. First question, we just want to know more about your career. Did I get that description right? What would you add?
Yeah, that was a pretty good description. The place I always start is, so you and I are roommates. I'm 22. I am a DCPS teacher through Teach for America. And back then I thought a lot about impact and I saw the world really black and white. So I bet it's the first month in my experience as a teacher. And I say, I know what I want to do. I want to be a district administrator. And I saw two types of district administrators. I saw great teacher becomes a principal, great principal works his or her way up through the system and ultimately becomes a superintendent and knows all about great instruction, but maybe doesn't know what it takes to manage a large organization. Or boom, you take a really successful individual in military or law, or whatever, put them into the superintendent role, great leader, but doesn't know what classroom instruction looks like. And I said, I want to be the best of both worlds. And so I had this really, really black and white 10-year plan. And it was teach in a number of different places. Ultimately, I taught in DC, in the Bronx, and a small village in Africa. Go get an MED and an MBA, consult for 3 years, and then go find a district role. And mainly through luck, I actually was able to follow that through the letter, and then had an opportunity to go join a charter management organization. And at the last second made a shift and joined an ed tech company. And for about the next 2 decades, I worked at a number of different education companies. They weren't all mission driven, but they were all focused on the area that I was really passionate about. And then recently, about 3 years ago, I made a leap. I met this unbelievable nonprofit entrepreneur running a literacy company focused on adolescent literacy. Company's called Story Shares. And she was the only person I could see in this space that was thinking about what happens if you get to 5th grade and you don't know how to read, or 10th grade, right? Maybe you're an immigrant, maybe you're dyslexic. And one day I called her up and I said, I want to invest in your company. I ended up buying just under half of the company and quitting my corporate job and helping run this company. And today I have this small fund. I think we'll probably talk about it a little bit more, but it's really dedicated to finding these great investment opportunities, but exclusively in the nonprofit space.
Amazing. Yeah, we definitely want to come back to that because we kind of have a career focus on this podcast. So Matt, tell us a little bit more about some of those kind of pivotal moments in your career. You described it sort of going to plan until it didn't. And then, of course, there's a new plan, or I think as Mike Tyson once said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. I don't know if that's apropos to how you would describe things, but what were those inflection points, those sliding doors moments in this really amazing cross-sector career you've had?
Yeah, I can think of two. So the first one I sort of alluded to. So just over 15 years ago, I'm grabbing coffee in Harvard Square, and I've sort of done all those steps that I was talking about within education. I got the degrees that I wanted, and I had an opportunity to join a charter management organization in the Boston
Hang on,
area.
had you parked your car in Harvard Yard?
I thought
lived
the
in
dad
Boston.
joke section was over.
I lived in Boston for over a decade. Thankfully, I don't sound like I'm from Boston, but um, and I'm grabbing coffee with a guy who ultimately became my boss at McGraw-Hill. And we're just chatting, and he's telling me he's just joined McGraw-Hill. McGraw-Hill has just been purchased by a private equity company. And halfway through, he tells me exactly why we're grabbing coffee. He says, "Matt, I want to offer you a job. I want you to come work for me." And I don't even pause. I say, "This is not what I want to do. I want to work on the same issues that I worked on in the classroom." And if you were to ask him, he said that his response was, "Are you kidding? We do that every day." I think his response was, "Well, you must be an idiot because we work on those sorts of issues every day." We have sort of a we don't fully agree, but whatever it was, that sentence really changed my career. And I went home and I thought about it and I talked to my wife and I decided that he was right. That McGraw Hill was really solving a lot of the same problems that I was trying to figure out in the classroom. And that one sentence is probably far and away the sort of number one big inflection point in my career.
And I know you have another example, but just to underscore that, what you're saying is that there's many definitions of impact in the sector that you care about. His was, we're making that very same impact, whereas you had a different perspective going in of more teaching and learning based in the classroom.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a theme throughout my career, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. But you remember when we were in our 20s, we would go to these parties with only classroom teachers. Sometimes we would put signs on the door that says like no classroom talk. But even if there was no classroom talk, we spent a lot of time talking about how do you have the greatest impact. And I felt like we were always, at least I was certainly like, well, you can only have impact if you're in the classroom, or you can only have impact if you're in X, Y, or Z. And the older I get, the more I sort of broaden that. And I'm amazed at, right? People say, oh, well, you can't have impact if you're going into the entertainment industry, right? What about Mr. Rogers, right? There's an example of somebody really making the world a better place in almost any industry you can think of.
Awesome,
And
awesome.
then,
Okay, inflection point number two.
yeah, I want to hear.
Yeah, this is relatively recent. So I have a good friend and he's very successful. He had a great corporate job. And one day he called me up and he said, quit my job and I'm going to start a venture capital firm. And it's going to be exclusively focused on investing in legal technology. This was before Claude. This was before OpenAI. And he said, I really think that the legal space is ripe for all sorts of great innovation, and I want to be on the forefront. And I said, that
And,
sounds
it,
like,
and this guy
sorry,
was a lawyer, had a ton of experience as an entrepreneur, right?
no, that was my response. He was an entrepreneur. He had done a number of cool things, but he was not a lawyer. He'd never worked for a law firm. He had no legal experience, and that was exactly my response. I was like, I don't know, man. Like, you don't know anyone in this space. You don't have the connections. And he wasn't arrogant. He wasn't like, oh, this is gonna be easy. He's like, yeah, this is tough. I'm not sure if I can do it, but this is what I want to do. And he made the leap and he's been unbelievably successful. He's really built a reputation in the space. He's been humble where he had to. He's learned what he needed to, and that experience really gave me the confidence. And I'm trying to do something similar in a very different space, but sort of I always think about him and how successful he's been and the sort of problems that he solved along.
Amazing, amazing. Well, we want to hear more about what you're up to now and your theory of change and your thesis there. But first, Jeremy, thoughts on what Matt shared so
Yeah.
far? Questions?
Yeah. So before we get into your current role, I want you to take that past experience and share that wisdom with the next generation. So we have all these listeners who are starting their careers. And obviously, it's a scary moment. There's all these question marks about AI and where you can actually build a solid career. A lot of the questions come down to how much do you want to plan out your career versus how much do you want to roll with the punches? Given what you've experienced, having had sort of both over the course of your career, what recommendation do you give to the next generation? Like, how should you think about sort of scaffolding out this plan for your future?
I think you should absolutely have a plan, but I think you should be really, really prepared to blow it all up at a moment's notice. And I think there are a couple of things that I highlight. This is one thing that I often talk to individuals who are early on in the career. The most common thing to do is you say, "Oh, where do I want to be?" Well, I want to be here. I'm going to find a dozen people who are here. And I'm going to see how they got there, and I'm just going to follow that path. The problem with that is that the world is changing, and so the path to get to where they are today is not necessarily the path to get to where you want to be in a few years. I think people often don't sort of recognize how easily things are changing. It is also true the number of times that I meet someone and I'm like, man, you were born to be in this role. And then the number of people that say they are non-traditional, it feels like it's over half, right? Everybody's like, well, don't do it the way that I did. But at some point, you know, that's just the norm. And the number of people that have a weird story is just bonkers to me. And then the final thing, and the reason why I always think, especially if you're in an impact career, you don't want to be afraid to move around and to jump around, is that when your focus is on impact, you're going to have some really tough days. And it is nice to be able to look at the problem from different perspectives. I worked with somebody in the New York public school system, and he would go home every day, and his 5-year-old son would say, Daddy, what do you do? And he didn't know how to explain it. So he said, Oh, I fix the schools. He said that one day. And his son, 5-year-old, was like, Oh, okay. And what he didn't realize is that every subsequent day when he came home, his son would say, So have you fixed the schools yet? And he would say no. And the son would be like, Oh, I guess you'll do it tomorrow, right? Like that, if that's your goal. And that kind of is what being in the impact space is, right? You have this goal. Every day you fail, and it can be unbelievably draining. And so I love examples of careers of people who jumped around, and there might be a common thread, but maybe they work for a nonprofit, a for-profit, and everything in between.
That's awesome. And then one quick follow up, and I'll turn it back to Omar. What if someone says, Hey, Matt, you had this whole dream of being a district admin. What if I have no idea what I should be dreaming about? How do you even like figure out who you should be focusing on as a role model in the first place?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a great question. I often say then, like, here's like a common thing, and I don't think business school is right for everyone, but I can't tell you how many times I ask someone's thinking about business school, and I say, oh, you're going to apply? And they're like, no, I don't think so because I don't quite know what I want to do yet. And I'm always like,
Mm.
but that's a perfect reason to go to business school, right? Because maybe you can imagine a dozen careers. Can't do all 12 careers, but you could go to a place where you can actually sit down and have a coffee or 12 coffees or 5 beers with someone who's done all these things and get as close as you can to that actual role. That's one. And then the other piece is I think people often don't realize how liberating and what a benefit it is to go do something and absolutely hate it, right? Like, yeah, I did X for a year and it was the worst thing ever. Great. You will never again wonder if that was the chosen career for you. You will not be 80 thinking, man, maybe I should have done that. How liberating is that? Check it off the list and then you get to move on to the next one.
Love that. Love that.
All right. Well, making the case for business school as a safe place to fail and as a place to get coffees and beers is what I hear.
Exactly. Yeah. And
That
maybe
that
whiskey.
may be the enduring value prop of business school at this point. Um, Disclosure, I work for one. So Matt, like we're putting cart before the horse a little bit here to be doing this look back of your career without understanding a little bit more like what you're doing now because you've made yet another pivot. So tell us about the fun that you've started, what your portfolio career now looks like with owning this education company in addition to trying to make these investments and how you see these different corporate structures kind of blurring together in this spirit of keeping impact front and center.
Yeah. So I have a very small fund, very small, that invests in nonprofit organizations. And you mentioned I just came back from an education conference, and I bet I said that about 50 times. And about 50 times, someone looked at me and they were like, what? Like, do you mean philanthropy? And I'm like, no, I don't mean philanthropy. And I've had to explain it a number of times. And here's how I always articulate it. So just like any private equity fund or any venture capitalist, I have a small number of limited partners who have given me money to invest in a particular sector that I think is really ripe to generate above market returns. And these individuals love the fact that a lot of what I'm doing has a positive impact and will benefit the world, but they have individuals that they're responsible for, and they are generally looking for an above market return. And the sector that I have chosen is the nonprofit space. And people are often sort of like, well, what do you mean? How do you invest in a nonprofit? And there are a handful of ways to do it. One example, and the one that I did with that first literacy company that I talked about, is you actually are, in certain circumstances, in different ways, you're able to transition from a nonprofit to a for-profit, a public benefit corporation. And while you do that, there are big benefits that the initial nonprofit gets, cash and other big benefits. And that's sort of one example. And there are a couple of examples that people know of. So for example, if you're not familiar, ACT, the testing company, was a nonprofit for decades and decades. It was actually purchased not that long ago by a private equity company. It is now a mission-driven for-profit. There are other ways to conduct these relationships, whether it's through a partnership or a revenue share or something like that. But essentially, what I am looking for is fantastic, my word is battle tested products that exist in that were built by nonprofits that really need additional capital for go to market or product development or a number of other things. And I'll give you an example of a sector, the K-12 curriculum sector. There are a number of fantastic for-profit curriculum companies producing great stuff, but there also are tons of really fantastic nonprofits in the K-12 curriculum space. And my analysis says that the nonprofits are roughly about 5% of the overall market. And if you look at the efficacy data and you look at the results that they're having around student achievement, it should be much larger. And I am actively looking for investments in that space, finding ways to get more and more capital into nonprofit curriculum companies to help them grow and expand, typically through growing their sales and marketing teams.
Very cool. Can I throw out an example, Matt, just to like illustrate for our audience?
Yeah.
So a couple years ago, I was working for Khan Academy, and we had early access to ChatGPT before it launched to the public through a partnership with OpenAI. We built out this AI-powered tutor, and we were trying to essentially license it to schools and to parents as a way of covering the massive cost of running it. But it was a pretty capital intensive business given how much money and energy goes into running AI. Is that the kind of place where maybe there is some kind of for-profit investment in that portion of the nonprofit as a way of accelerating and getting it to scale to a higher level of impact? Would that be a good target?
That's exactly the type of use case, right? And one example could be, and I'm a big fan of Khan Academy, and they're doing a million things. You could pull out that particular tool and that particular code base and create a separate entity. You could work out a deal with a investor where you say, hey, put some capital in and we'll find some equitable way to split revenue. There's a million different ways to sort of skin the cat, but it's exactly that idea. It's like, hey, we know this product works, but how do we expand it? And one of the things that's really interesting is that you often find this really amazing product market fit in the nonprofit space. And the reason is if you put $1 million of seed funding into a for-profit company, that for-profit entrepreneur will, in a very savvy way, put money into product development, but also go to market and a million other things. If you put $1 million into a nonprofit, oftentimes all of that money, literally every cent, goes towards building the product. And so oftentimes you find these unbelievable products that have been refined and improved over years and years or even decades. And you say, man, this is really helping people. Now, how do we really scale it?
So this is kind of entrepreneurship through acquisition for impact or maybe for education. And you're talking about almost like monetizable products within nonprofits. But I'm curious, like, is this actually helping? Because there's also a huge problem in nonprofits that you've sort of alluded to, which is this fundraising treadmill, right? And the fact that you have to constantly be doing it, as opposed to companies or even startups who raise money in rounds. I'm trying to figure out, are you helping address that problem too? And then when you find these products, is that a separate entity that you create?
So to your first question, the way I think about it is that I have a presentation deck where I walk through the concept. And the very first slide on the deck is guess which is the nonprofit and which is the for-profit. And I give you financials for two different organizations. I show you their revenue. I show you the CEO compensation, a couple other metrics, and then I also actually show you the mission of the organization. And I've shared this 100 times and no one can ever actually distinguish. And one of my big things is I think when people hear me, they often say, oh, I was kind of expecting you to say something like for-profits are just better or they can be more nimble. And I don't think that at all. I actually think there's much more similarity between nonprofits and for-profits than most people realize. And grant funding has its challenges, but so does venture capital. But I think the big difference, sort of the one thing that a for-profit can do that a nonprofit can't, is that a for-profit can go negative for a long period of time, right? Amazon didn't make a profit for, I don't know, decades, right? And it was because they had this great concept, this great business, and they just needed to keep investing and keep investing. And nonprofits don't have that possibility. And I think that the philanthropic market is doing some really fantastic things, but every now and then an entrepreneur needs a big fat check and they need it right now. Maybe they're in a period of hyper growth within an industry and they're really competing against a number of for-profits, but whatever it is, and sort of that's where I exist, that inflection point where you have amazing product market fit and you need a different source of capital because you need that big fat check and you need it right away. And then your second question was sort of the entity question, right? What does that look like? In certain cases, it does mean helping an organization transition from a nonprofit typically to a public benefit corporation, a mission-driven for-profit. But that's not always the way we do it. And other examples include revenue sharing partnerships and things like that. And one of the reasons why transitioning the entity isn't always the right thing to do is because oftentimes I'm talking to nonprofits that have really, really healthy philanthropic funding and things like that. And obviously, when you transition to a for-profit, almost for certain that's going to dry up. And so oftentimes there are examples where I'm talking about investing in a nonprofit as a for-profit entrepreneur right alongside a foundation, and we're even coordinating it. And the tax status doesn't change. We're just finding different ways to get the capital in and different ways for sort of my shareholders' interests to be reflected and for us to get a return on our capital.
I got to tell you, Matt, this is mind blowing. Omar and I have also spent a couple decades in the nonprofit sector and the for profit sector. And it used to seem like those were two very different worlds. Obviously, along came B Corps and double bottom line organizations, and now the lines started to blur. Now you've added this sort of like third way of stay in nonprofit, but access these capital markets you didn't have access to before. Imagine someone walks into Omar's office at Darden, over to the Baden Institute, and says, "Hey, I want to start something that's going to be really good for the world, but also really effective financially." How should people be thinking through like the choices between nonprofit, B Corp? Like, what are the different flavors out there today that people should know about?
Yeah. Well, one goal that I hope happens out of the work that I'm doing, in the for-profit space, there are LLCs and C corps and S corp, and people sort of often acknowledge like, oh well, I think I'm going to start my organization as an LLC, but if I need to transition to a C corp, I'll do that, and there are different benefits to doing that. And I hope that at some point we almost think about the nonprofit, for-profit, public benefit corporation sort of distinction in that similar way, and we're like, this could be right for the right time, but I'm preserving optionality. I think one of the big questions. So there are a lot of advantages to, if you're going to be a for-profit, you're going to likely raise at some point some money from a venture capitalist, and that venture capitalist is going to, unfortunately, the world works in venture capital is you're swinging for the fences, right? You want those home runs. It's sort of home run or bust. And one of the challenges of that approach is that sometimes there are great profitable businesses that might be single digit ARR and could really be quite lucrative, but are not something that a venture capitalist is going to be interested in. And I think ultimately that's one of the big questions. Do I have a business that a venture capitalist would even consider? And if you don't, then oftentimes sort of that for-profit route doesn't exist. But I like the idea of, saying, hey, I'm really mission driven. I'm going to focus on building this great business. It'll be supported through philanthropy. And then at some point down the road, if I realize, wow, I've got this amazing product, I do see that path to those amazing returns, I can make that transition. If you do make the transition, the best part about the whole scenario is the acquisition price that a VC or PE firm would pay for that investment goes right back to the nonprofit. And that nonprofit is the one who profits from your amazing idea, which I think is so cool. And then the last part you were asking, there are B Corps and there are public benefit corporations. I think those are great. They are simply ways of really demonstrating to everyone that you are mission driven and you care about the end stakeholder. And whether you do that officially and formally or not, I really encourage any business where the entrepreneur is mission driven to really be as vocal as you can about it. I think it's a great marketing decision, and it's just also a great message to future entrepreneurs.
Wow, what a world.
Yeah, that hypothetical of aspiring entrepreneurs coming into my office asking this question of what tax status they should be is not hypothetical. It happens all the time. And you've given us some great thoughts on that, Matt. What I see is regardless of how they choose initially to answer that question, it is very rare nowadays to find a Gen Z entrepreneur that doesn't have a mission something as part of their business. And that's really important in entrepreneurship because it's hard and you have to have that thing that connects you to the work and brings you back to get through the grind. So Matt, I'm kind of curious, this is all sounding very neat and tidy, but I know from being your friend that, maybe it's not quite that, it doesn't always work out that way in reality. And I know you said your fund was very small. So, like, what percentage proven is this model? Is it 90%? Is it 9%? Is it 0.9%? Are you the only guy out there doing this? Is this just kind of impact investing by another name? Tell us like state of the state.
Yeah, I might have to say, like, if I had to answer that question in just a few words, I might say that I'm cautiously optimistic. Yeah. So I have done a grand total of 2 deals in this space, and I have talked to numerous entrepreneurs in the nonprofit space, most of whom say, yes, I'm not interested in this. And it's a real sort of challenge every day, right? And every day you get a little bit more information. I really live my life that sort of one of my goals is not to be sitting, on my front porch at 80 and thinking about, oh, I wish I had tried X, Y, or Z. And so that if this is a spectacular failure, at least I'll say, that was great. I really gave it a shot. But I think it still remains to be seen sort of what this looks like. What I'm 100% certain is that there's an actual problem to be solving, which is really, really great products that have been under-resourced where you just don't see a really way to scale something that is really, really helping people. And that's sort of what gets me out of bed every morning. But I do think that we kind of have this idea, and I use this phrase all the time. I can't tell you how many times I say, mission isn't defined by tax status. But I think we still do have this concept in this country. And I can tell you, when I was 20, I really believed this, which is that, sort of, if you want to change the world, go be a nonprofit, and everybody else does something else. And there's sort of 1,000,001 hurdles along the way.
And then so for that Gen Zer walking into Omar's office, you know, it's interesting. The three of us, I think, started businesses relatively later in our careers. But obviously, society has that kind of meme of, oh, you got to be 21 like Mark Zuckerberg. You got to be young and aggressive. Having seen both your own story, Matt, and the stories of other entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs you met, any rules of thumb for people who are thinking about, do I start my own thing? Do I go into the regular workforce? How do you know when the time is right? How do you know when to take the plunge?
Yeah.
Do I do both as more and more people are?
Haha, see, a side hustle.
One of there's some study, and I don't remember it, but it was interesting where they actually did a little bit of research into entrepreneurs and found out that they were not nearly as risk tolerant as most people thought. And there actually was a lot of risk aversion among entrepreneurs. And they were much more likely actually to say, hey, I'm going to do this as a side hustle and things like that. I think the most important advice that I have is solve one problem for one person and go from there. And Jeremy, I'm sure you know the story better than I do, but that is 100% the story of Sal Khan and Khan Academy, right?
Right.
I think it was his nephew that he was helping with some math problems, right? And
Right.
everybody's thinking about scale, and everyone's thinking about how do you get to millions and millions of active users. Like, solve one problem for one person and go from there. This literacy company that I invested in, one of our foundational products are adolescent decodables. So decodable readers that are written at a kindergarten level, but have more mature themes and protagonists, have a teenager on the cover. So if you're 15 and you're learning how to read, you have a book that really appeals to you. You don't have to read Hop on Pop. And, a couple of years ago, it started with a school chief academic officer talking about this need. And I was on the call with our CEO and founder, and she said, I think I could write something like that. And I said, how long would it take? And she said, give me the weekend. And she created this decodable. I still remember it. It's actually no longer in a catalog. It was called Charlie's Choice. It was about a girl named Charlie trying to decide which of two boys she wanted to date. So we really picked like a more mature theme. And it taught the CH sound. One boy was Chuck and the other boy had a CH name. And she was able to use only words that a very, very early reader would need, but work on this more mature theme. And that is kind of almost, that product is almost kind of the foundation of our of our entire organization. So that would be my first suggestion. And then the second is, keep in mind that whenever you're starting, you only need to convince one person to get started. And sometimes that's a funder or something like that. But I can't tell you, and Omar, I bet you hear this a lot in your job. I hear people saying things like, "Oh, I would love to go work in a school district, but I've never been a classroom teacher," and they wouldn't be interested. They wouldn't be interested in me, right? And the reality is that might be true 80% of the time, 70% of the time, 50% of the time, but you just have to convince one hiring manager that you're worth it. And I think when you figure that out, it prevents you from these broad generalizations that can really interfere with your dreams.
Love that. Love that. That is such great advice. I think it's relevant for mid-career and late career as well, which maybe we're waking up and finding ourselves in. Matt, you've blown our mind. I should disclose at this point in the episode that Matt and I were also roommates, fresh out of college during our Teach for America days. Matt, you were the basement dweller. But despite that, you've just always inspired me. I think you've made really inspired career choices. I've always been inspired by your self-awareness, your focus on finding new ways to make impact. I remember when you just like up and left for Tanzania to just go try to teach there and intern for free at the United Nations. Just always just staying on the front foot of like, how can I make impact with my one short go round? And for that, you inspire me, and I think what you're doing now is just further proof of that. So thank you for sharing more of your thesis, and I'll give you the floor for any parting thoughts you may have.
Well, first question is, when is the part of the podcast when I talk about poor decisions you made in your 20s?
Unfortunately, that time has passed.
A bummer.
Yeah.
I think what you're doing is great. I really love sort of the lens that you all are taking. And yeah, I think every single day, sort of the path to getting where you want to be gets a little bit easier and people get more open-minded. And there's no day like the present to do the thing that you've always wanted to do.
All right. Love it. YOLO. And also, it's tough to be an innovator. It's tough to be trying new things. And to your point, Matt, 50 out of 50 people might not get it right now, but tomorrow might be 49 out of 50, and you go from there. I'm Matt Haldeman. Thanks for joining us on WTF Is Up.
Thanks for
Talk to
having me.
everyone next time.